Great. Thank you all so much for coming to our panel this afternoon. My name is Kayla Blado. I am the moderator of this panel. As of the end of March, I'm the new press secretary for the National Labor Relations Board, and I'm learning so much in my new role. I'm not a lawyer, but maybe I'll learn a thing or two from some of you labor lawyers at this conference to bring back and impress my colleagues at the board with. If you've never read the National Labor Relations Act, and knowing this audience, I'm sure most of you have, Section 1 basically states that it is the policy of the United States to encourage collective bargaining and protect workers' full freedom of association. The Act also grants the right to employees to work together to advocate to improve their working conditions. In this panel, we'll talk with union organizers, an academic, and a journalist about their experiences with young workers who are choosing to exercise these rights. Before I get to them, a little about myself. When we were planning this panel so many months ago, I was serving as the president of the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union, a national union that now represents about 40 nonprofit organizations across the country. I say now represents because this union was once a scrappy little local, only representing a handful of workers. In the last several years, the union has tripled in size as more nonprofit workers decided to organize. As president, I worked with a lot of workers who were primarily in their 20s and 30s and helped them exercise their right to form a union. While my experience was with a particular cross-section of workers, mainly white-collar workers, many of them with at least a bachelor's degree and mostly in urban areas, I heard the same issues and concerns raised time and time again. There were economic concerns like raising low wages to keep up with the cost of living and paying their student debt. But there were, and also things like eliminating gender and racial wage gaps and obtaining better health insurance. But many of their motivations for organizing had to do with sharing decision-making and creating transparency within their organizations. Co-determination, in this case, was having a union representative on the nonprofit's board of directors was a really common bargaining priority. Additionally, having trainings for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and creating more structure and more regularity in hiring and pay and promotions were also high on that list. During the pandemic, workers were quick to switch their organizing that normally happened in person at bars after work to Signal, WhatsApp, and Slack, and started holding Zoom meetings each night to talk. They used social media to highlight their wins and act collectively to advocate for changes at their workplace. Obviously, this is a highly specific set of circumstances to this group of workers, but perhaps some of the lessons learned during this challenging time could continue to be used alongside with more traditional techniques in the future. My point is that in many ways, young workers are organizing for the same reasons as previous generations have, but in some ways they're different. We'll explore those similarities and differences today with our panel and break it down further so that we're not talking about young workers as a monolith. Now I'd like to introduce our panel. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Alexander Hertel Fernandez, a political scientist at Columbia University, who studies the political economy of the United States with an emphasis on the politics of organized interests and public policy. Next, we'll hear from Nastaran Mohit, the organizing director of the NewsGuild of New York, CWA Local 31003, where she oversees the union's organizing program. She has worked as a New York City-based labor and community organizer since 2003. We'll also hear from Ken Lang, the Director of Organizing for the United Auto Workers, where he works to help manufacturing and other workers build strong unions that can advance the larger struggle for a more just, equitable, and inclusive economy and society. And finally, we'll hear from Michelle Chen. Michelle is a contributing writer for The Nation. She's also a contributing editor at Dissent Magazine, a contributing writer at In These Times, and a co-producer of Asia Pacific Forum podcast and Dissent's Belabored podcast. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Hertel Fernandez. I should also mention after we go through all our panelists, we'll open it up to questions. You can put questions in the chat now if during the presentation, if you think of them, but we'll get to them afterward. And so now I'll turn it over to Dr. Hertel Fernandez, who will present about some of his recent research on the issues that young workers care about.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Kayla, and thanks so much to all of you for turning out for this discussion. I already see a number of folks in the room who I know my research draws on, and I'm very curious to hear your questions and reactions to the material that we're going to be sharing with you. I'm just going to pull up a few slides to provide some empirical context for our discussion and hopefully offer a set of provocations for both the panelists and the folks who are assembled here to respond to and to engage with. And as Kayla mentioned, my background is one of a researcher and an academic. So while I don't spend time interacting directly with and organizing folks on the ground, I hope that this perspective that I bring from some of the survey work that I've done in particular can provide a macro picture of what do we know about how workers, and in particularly younger workers, think about the labor movement and think about labor unions. I should also say that, like Kayla, I am in a new role right now, serving at the Department of Labor, but today in this panel, I will be representing my personal capacity. So nothing that I share should be taken as statements or positions of the department. So in particular, I wanted to start with sort of four broad areas of descriptive facts about how workers, and especially young workers, think about the labor movement. And first, looking at overall support for unionization by age, but also by race and occupation, and hopefully introducing some nuance into the relationship between age and support for unions. Second, I wanted to talk a little bit about how union members interact with others outside of the labor movement, and in particular, the exposure that young workers may have to folks who are inside the labor movement through personal connections, among others. Third, I wanted to reflect a little on the importance of collective action for teaching young people about the labor movement, particularly in light of some of the statistics that I will have just presented about the degree to which young workers have these personal connections to the labor movement. And lastly, I wanted to mention some features of labor representation that are especially important for young workers, but also ways in which the sort of things that young workers desire from labor representation are by and large quite similar to the preferences of other kinds of workers. So hopefully you'll come away with these stylized facts with a sense of the places where we do see important differences by age, but also the places where we don't. And I think both sides of that, as Kayla mentioned, are important to introduce for this discussion. So I wanted to start by giving you a sense of the voice gap, as others have referred to this measure, which is the difference between the proportion of workers who are not currently in unions, who say that they would join a union if an election were held at their job today, and current levels of union membership, breaking this down by age. And this comes from survey work that I've done together with a number of collaborators, including Tom Koken and graduate students at MIT, as well as collaborators at Columbia University. And what we see here is consistent with a long line of past research, which is that when we look at age and workers who are outside of the labor movement right now, younger workers emerge as having some of the largest voice gaps between current levels of union membership and where workers would like to be represented. So if you look at the age bucket of 18 to 24-year-olds, you can see that they have one of the lowest levels of union membership according to recent BLS data. But over 70% of them in that 2018 survey said that they would join a union if one were available to them on the job. And you can see here that there is a declining age gradient to preferences for joining unions, with older workers being less supportive of joining a union. But still, even for the oldest workers, that the degree to which workers say that they would like to join unions greatly exceeds the current levels of union membership. As we know, the current levels of union representation are not reflective of what workers themselves say they want. But let's unpack this and complicate this story a little bit further. In that first chart that I showed you, I was only looking at workers who said that they had an opinion about union representation if an election were held at their job today. But it turns out that many workers, and especially younger workers, don't have an opinion about union representation. And so on this plot, I've shown the degree to which workers express or do not express opinions about union elections. And what we can see here is an age gradient, but one where it's younger workers that are less likely to have formed or crystallized an opinion about the labor movement. So while it's the case that among those with opinions, opinions, support tends to be strongest among younger workers. It also tends to be the case that there are large numbers of younger workers who haven't yet formed an opinion about the labor movement and about labor representation. A second piece of nuance that I wanted to add to the discussion is by race. And so here I've shown you preferences for union representation broken out by age, as I did on that first chart, but further subdividing workers by their race or ethnicity in three categories: white, Black, and Hispanic. And what you can see here is two trends that I think are relevant for our discussion. The first is that the age gradient really only appears among white workers. Among workers of color, you can see generally high levels of support and much less of an age gradient than you do for white workers. And so when we talk about that age gradient that we saw in the first chart, it's really a story of white workers rather than workers of color, who tend to be much more consistent across age in their support for labor unions. The last piece of evidence that I wanted to share to nuance this story about age gradients in support for the labor movement is looking at the union representation gap by occupation and asking whether it's the case that young workers tend to be in occupations where there's a larger voice gap relative to other age groups. And so this looks at the difference between union membership and preferences for union representation among currently unrepresented workers who fall into the age category of 18 to 29-year-old. And what we see here is that the largest voice gaps, and these occupations are ranked in order of how large that voice gap is, between current levels of union membership and preferences for union representation, tend to be in blue-collar service occupations like personal care, sales, healthcare support, food preparation, office and administrative support. And by and large, those tend to be the occupations across other age categories where this gap between union representation and preferences for union representation are the largest. So on an occupational basis, it doesn't tend to be the case, at least in national survey data, that we see a big age gap. That is to say, those occupations where there's a lot of unmet demand tend to be the same across ages. Next, I wanted to share a little bit about young workers' connections to the labor movement. And one important way that people form attitudes about labor unions, the labor movement more generally, is through personal connections that they may have through their family or through their friends. And one notable fact about younger workers is that they tend to have fewer personal connections, especially close friends in the labor movement as compared to older workers. And we can think of a variety of mechanisms why this is the case, but it turns out to be important in understanding the sources of young workers' preferences for union representation, and could be one important reason why there are a number of younger workers in particular who have not yet crystallized their attitudes about labor unions, because they lack these same personal connections to the labor movement that older workers do. Another way of thinking about young workers' familiarity with unions is to ask them whether or not they would know how to form a union if they would want to at their job. And we can do that either by asking workers that question directly, or by asking items related to, say, the NLRA and NLRB related unionization process. And it turns out that regardless of how you pose these questions, it tends to be the case that younger workers are less familiar and knowledgeable about the unionization process than are older workers. And so this is an important obstacle to the extent that younger workers do have higher levels of preferences for union representation, but are not able to act on them if they do not know exactly how to go about forming the union, if they haven't had that kind of firsthand contact with people who are able to share that information, particularly friends or family members. And you can see here that overall, knowledge about union formation is quite low. So even for older workers who have these higher rates, it tends to be fewer than 1 in 5 workers who say that they would know how to form a union at their job. So facing a lower degree of personal connection to the labor movement, as well as less firsthand knowledge about the unionization process, what are the ways that young people learn about the labor movement and form attitudes about the labor movement? This is an area of research that I've explored with some of my collaborators at Columbia. And in particular, we've looked at the importance of collective action and strikes in teaching workers and particularly younger workers about what unions are and what they can do for workers. And so this particular set of statistics that I'm going to share with you in this graph come from a survey of workers that we fielded in the Northeast shortly after a large grocery store strike at the Stop and Shop chain that happened in those states, that were large scale labor actions that affected a number of customers and community members across those states. And what we found was that it tended to be the case that it was younger workers who both had greater firsthand exposure and were more likely to say that the strikes mattered for what happened in their own lives and changed the ways that they thought about the labor movement. So we see here that firsthand exposure to that kind of collective action, labor action, mattered most for these younger workers, and possibly because they didn't have those personal connections to the labor movement before the labor actions took place. So last, I wanted to close by asking the question, when it comes to thinking about labor representation, not just knowledge or preferences about labor representation generally, but when it comes to the form of labor representation, do younger workers want different things as compared to older workers? Are there strong age cleavages in preferences for labor representation? And this comes from work that I've done with collaborators at MIT. And really the story here that I want to share that's, I think the most important message to take away is that by and large, there were not large age gradients in preferences for the forms of labor representation. Again, at least in the ways that we designed our surveys, which I'm happy to discuss about in more detail. But there were a couple exceptions to that general tendency. It tended to be the case, perhaps surprisingly, that younger workers tended to be more enthusiastic about labor organizations that could offer them job protections as compared to older workers. And younger workers tended to be more supportive of labor organizations that used strikes and other forms of collective action that tended to be valued more by younger workers than older workers. So happy to go into more detail into those findings, but I think I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how sort of these macro level trends and descriptive statistics gel with the experiences of folks who have been on the ground organizing younger workers and thinking about the sort of demands that the younger workers are making as they're forming unions and bargaining for contracts. So thanks again for the discussion, and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was fascinating. I would love to read anything you write on this topic. Great. So next we will hear from Ken Lang, who is the organizing director at UAW. Basically, you know, just an open-ended question to Ken, kind of what are your reactions to the data we just saw? And, you know, in your personal experience, have you seen any of those things reflected, and maybe what's different?
Sure. Thanks, Kayla, for pulling this together, and thanks for those slides, Alex. I looked at them a lot closer yesterday, and first off, you know, our union represents a really diverse array of workers, and I think I was originally contacted about this because of our recent growth in academic worker organizing, which is I would call mostly young, not every graduate assistant or even every postdoctoral researcher is young, but I would say mostly. So I'll mostly focus on that area in terms of my responses, but overall, my response to the data and the slides you put together is that I find it very encouraging. I think, you know, any possibility of much more mass worker organizing than we've seen in recent decades, the kind that, you know, has the capacity to effectively redistribute lots of resources, establish rights in the workplace, and also drive broader social and economic and racial justice more generally, necessarily is going to have to include strong participation from young workers. And so these numbers are very, I think, encouraging overall. And I think especially encouraging for manufacturing in the auto industry, where the decline in union density has sort of been, the auto companies, for example, have used the non-union companies have used their growing influence over the industry as a whole to drive down standards pretty significantly. And one of the intended effects of that, in addition to just cutting costs, et cetera, is to try to lower expectations. And that obviously can be an obstacle in organizing. So seeing this kind of data is very encouraging to know that sort of inherently there's an inclination toward unionization. I would say in terms of, in relation to our sort of growth in academic organizing, which again is mostly young workers in the last really several decades, but it's really kind of increased rapidly in the last 8 years. I think since 2013, when we reestablished recognition at New York University for graduate assistants, if you count the 17,000 person student researcher unit that just petitioned for card check recognition in California, about 41,000 academic workers have chosen the UAW just since 2013. And getting back to the slides, I would say that I think part of what has driven that success connects to those slides Alex had. They're like 7, 8, 9 on your presentation, but the ones about personal connection and level of knowledge about the process of organizing unions, and the sort of attraction to collective action as a feature of unionization. I think the way our organizing has evolved, usually in geographically concentrated areas like New York, like California, like Boston, the heavy involvement of workers who had recently organized their own shop in organizing at new shops, which was certainly a feature of lots of the large organizing that happened in the 30s and 40s. I think it broke down that if there was an inherent lack of knowledge about the process or lack of personal connection in their, prior to a campaign starting at their university, if they didn't have those connections, the participation of workers who had recently organized and won and had success and could talk about success totally negated that as a potential factor that might work against organizing. So, organizers from NYU, for example, played a huge role in helping graduate workers at the New School and Columbia and UConn in 2013, 14, and 15 get those campaigns going. And those relationships expanded to Harvard as well, sometimes within the same institution, right? So the student researcher unit that just filed for recognition in California, those folks were heavily influenced by the existence of the teaching assistant union at the university for many years, the postdoc union. And so I think that your slides just kind of drove that home for me. And I think in some of the other sectors where you've seen kind of large scale organizing happening, maybe cultural institutions or digital media organizing, nonprofit that Kayla described, I think you probably have the same feature where there are heavily involved rank and file workers from previous campaigns or related campaigns who are talking to each other across workplaces that have helped those things succeed. And I think that, sort of that's an old model. I mean, if you go back and read William Z. Foster about steelworker organizing in the 20s and 30s, you'll see that aspect of organizing being very important. So I think it's a good reminder. And so I think I'll just stop there, but thanks again.
Thanks, Ken. Great. Now we will hear from Nastaran Mohit, who is the organizing director of NewsGuild of New York, CWA 31003. Same kind of questions for you. What were your reactions to this data? How do you see it playing out your organizing, anything that this doesn't cover that you would like to cover.
Great, thank you, Kayla. And thank you so much, Alex, for putting these slides together. I think they're really illuminating. I actually, when I was looking at slide, I think number 3, where it showed the difference between workers, the vast difference between workers who would join a union who are actually represented by a union. It is so stark, it's so alarming. And I always say when we see these graphics as organizers, we should really print these up and wake up to them every single day with that mandate that we have so much work to do. But I have to say, on a positive note, I've either participated in or spoken on panels about young workers for many, many years. And I really feel, as I'm sure many of you do, that this is a moment where we actually are very hopeful. And I think that the upward statistics are showing us that there really is. I know we always say that things are changing, and they really aren't. The more they change, the more they stay the same, but it really does feel like things are moving in a positive direction for the first time in a very long time. My union is, I'm the organizing director of the NewsGuild of New York, which is located in New York City. We're part of a larger national union, NewsGuild, part of CWA, Communication Workers of America. And our local in New York represents about over 3,000, mostly media professionals. We represent some nonprofit workers, but largely media professionals across the New York City regional area. And we have been going through a transformative change in our union over the last few years. And the kind of change that is very much mirrored in the slides that Alex presented. We are a union of mostly white collar professionals. And I think, as has been said before, we're seeing these upward trends in mostly white collar professions, in the nonprofit sector, in journalism, in academia. And it shows, and those slides really show how much work there still is left to be done in other industries and for workers of color in this country. We have, over the last, I would say, starting in 2015, there are a few things that really started this transformation in our local, at our local, and also in our international union. You know, giving credit where credit's due, the Writers Guild of America East, which is another union that represents mostly entertainment workers, but started organizing journalists in 2015 starting with Gawker in, I believe, June of 2015. It was really the first time that a shop was organized in such a public, visible way. You know, they had an article in the New York Times. They got a lot of attention, and it was mostly on social media that a lot of the attention around this organizing drive was paid. And so that really started to open up this space for other digital journalists to start talking about, having conversations in their newsrooms about what it might look like for them to follow the same route. Maybe we should form a union, just like our Gawker colleagues. Most of print media in the US was already unionized. When you think of the New York Times, Reuters, the Washington Post, all of the legacy publications for the most part are union and have been union for decades, for generations. And so this was the first time that digital media, which is largely young, under the age of 35, where workers working in digital media started to explore unionization. And many of these workers were learning about the process on social media, and mostly on Twitter. So they would see one shop organize and then another shop organize, and they would follow every single detail of those organizing drives. And so I started working full time at the Guild. It was the first time that the NewsGuild in 2015 put resources into organizing. This didn't just come out of nowhere. We know that we need organizers. And so once the Guild started to actually commit the resources to hiring organizers, we were able to really set out intentionally to build union density in media and in digital media in particular. So over the last few years, we have increased our membership significantly. We've added nearly 30 bargaining units to our local alone. And over the next few months, in the year 2021, we will have doubled our membership. And we're just getting started. So it's a really incredible transformation that has led to the addition of younger members, mostly left-leaning, who have joined our executive committee, who have run for union office, who are not just members of our local, but are leading. We now have a member organizer program where we're having some of our journalists that organized a few years ago training up the next crop of organizers from Forbes and Business Insider and BuzzFeed. And we are seeing that the kind of the real deep understanding of what organizing is no longer just happening, right? Like our members are not just learning about the organizing process on Twitter. They're going through rigorous training. They're helping other shops organize. And we're seeing this really nice kind of this match between the kind of collective consciousness around organizing, which is largely playing out on social media, and the real deep organizing that's happening within our union. Because we know that, that superficial kind of social media attention only goes so far, that workers really need to be trained in their workplace. Organizing is hard. It's difficult work, as you all know. And it's not just the fun, sexy stuff like announcing your union with a Twitter account, which a lot of workers get excited about, but it's actually learning how to take on the boss. And especially in media, which has been going through an absolutely gut-wrenching period over the last few years with hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. We really need to be training up workers to take on some enormous battles if journalism is even going to exist in the years to come. So thank you for your slides. Hopefully later I can talk a little bit more about some of the things that we're bargaining over. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Great, thank you so much. We will now hear from Michelle Chen, and Michelle Chen is a longtime labor journalist. And as a reminder, after that, I'll ask a few questions, but you can add your questions to the chat now if you would like, if you have them, or wait until the end, but we'll get to them after Michelle goes. So go ahead, Michelle.
Hi. I can't believe I remembered to unmute myself. I'm getting better at the Zoom thing. Thanks for putting together this panel, and it's great to be in a Zoom room with people from unions that I've gotten to interview over the years, and so it's always nice to see people in a different kind of setting. So I come at this from a slightly different perspective because I'm, even though I am part of a union, because in my other academic, my other hat, I'm an academic, and so I'm actually a member of the Professional Staff Congress at CUNY, but I primarily I'm involved with the labor movement as an observer. I've chronicled a lot of stories about organizing drives, as well as just labor issues that people struggle with, and how labor movements tend to grow, both here in the US and in different parts of the world. So in terms of young people in particular, I think it's worth noting that we're at sort of a peculiar moment in our politics where we have a lot of young people who are, relatively speaking, fairly progressive or left-leaning in their sort of political ethos, and yet are much less likely to have any sort of organic connection to the labor movement, or know anyone in a union, or come from a union family, right? And so, and that distance from the labor movement ends up sort of probably compounding itself over generations, right? Because some of that institutional memory tends to fade, and so maybe Generation Z will be even more bereft of organic union connections than millennials are. But a couple of years ago, ago, I think I came across an interesting report from the Economic Policy Institute, where Kayla used to work, about young people in unions, noting that 3/4 of people who joined unions in 2017 were actually under the age of 34. And so they ended up being sort of the age cohort that sort of posted the strongest gains, particularly in light of the fact that they actually constitute less than 40% of total employment. So they were sort of disproportionately joining unions. Part of that is a function of the fact that they were sort of starting from a lower base to begin with, and other age cohorts were actually sort of declining. And so young people sort of had a relatively large share. But it was interesting to note because I think it's an interesting statistical parallel to the slides that Alex was showing sort of the voice gap, which is to say that, maybe 2017 was an indicator that, the efforts to address that gap were perhaps working in some areas, and there wasn't actually any data that would have broken it down by sector. Unfortunately, it was based on American Community Survey data. But it is worth noting that historically younger workers have actually been less likely than their older counterparts to be union members, right? So, and in 2017, it turned out that, out of the 858,000 net new jobs for workers under the age of 35, about 1/4 of them was a union job. I would actually suspect that a lot of those gains in union membership were not in the sectors that we are talking about right now, because, in a lot of the professional and sort of white collar settings, when you organize a shop, it's actually not a huge number of workers per se. So in terms of like the actual volume of union membership, I would imagine that in many cases those were young people who were perhaps joining incumbent unions at their workplaces, and so perhaps they were in industries that already had considerable union coverage. But just sort of moving away from the statistics, I think one of the things I've generally taken away from interviewing young people and young people who are organizing and young people who are working in different sectors is that the interests of young workers are not all that different for that of older workers. And like the interests of older workers, they tend to be segregated somewhat by class, by income level, by a little bit perhaps by industry, and as well as by race, ethnicity, and gender. And so you do see those nuances kind of come out. But one of the things that maybe young workers have in common, I would say, is that I would say workers who are generally in their 30s and under, I guess you could call them, broadly speaking, millennials and zillennials, they've grown up in the wake of the Great Recession, and many of them are, in a very material sense, suffering from some of the scars of that economic downturn, and that will likely affect their future prospects for many years. And so we're actually seeing a huge sort of millennial wealth gap, as well as a racial wealth gap on top of that. And we see inequality growing in all sorts of ways, in a way that very especially affects young people. And that's not just white collar professionals, of course, but I do think that the fact that there are so many college educated professionals who are just joining the workforce, who feel that kind of precarity, has probably affected the way we see labor organizing, the way we see young people's critique of capitalism kind of playing out in the public sphere more. And I also wanted to flag surveys that indicated that, I think like a fair majority, 60% of millennials support a complete change of our economic system away from capitalism. So you, like in survey data, you actually see some of that at least sort of sentimental critique of capitalism, and by some measures, favoring of socialism coming out. I think that doesn't necessarily translate into people actually organizing their workplaces, but it is worth noting that maybe some of the increased interest in unions and perhaps some of the fascination with joining the labor movement might come from a general disillusionment with capitalism. There was also a project looking at the lives of young workers done by the UCLA Labor Center. And it found that, and this is actually a survey of young workers who are not necessarily, college graduates or professionals or anything. They were, ordinary young people just, trying to earn a living. And about half of them ended up, a good percentage of them indicated that they probably didn't match the stereotype of young people that is often played out in the media. Half of them were working to support their families. Less than 1% were spending anything they earned on recreational or leisure activities. And 9 out of 10 of them actually noted that they had no control over their work schedule. And so I think some of that data kind of cut against popular perceptions of young people and perhaps even of young people and their attitudes towards work, in the sense that these are folks who in many ways are pretty much match low-income workers in any age cohort in terms of their economic precarity and the lack of control they have over their lives. Over the past year, I think my colleague Sarah and I have been collecting stories about workers in the pandemic and how they've been faring. And it has been really interesting to see how many of them are young people, and certainly not all of them are working in media or white collar professions. A number of workers that I've spoken to are working jobs like Amazon, and a number of the Amazon workers who were fired or retaliated against after speaking out over pandemic-related safety conditions over the past year were in fact quite young. I think the media focused less on the fact that they were young and more on the fact that they were Amazon workers, which is fine, because I think that's where the media's lens sort of fell. But if you look at the number of the workers who've been organizing at Amazon, who've sort of been putting themselves out there, a number of them are in their 20s. I think Chris Smalls, who is one of the first workers, who's actually a low-level manager at Amazon to be fired. He was, and he actually took his case to the NLRB. Jordan Flowers, these are all people in their 20s and 30s who genuinely felt that their work was putting them in danger. And in many ways, they felt that they needed to speak out against their employer as a matter of perhaps life and death for some of them. Jordan Flowers actually had an underlying medical condition that led to him sort of refusing to go back to work at his warehouse in Staten Island. And a number of workers that I spoke to were during the pandemic who were young, were actually organizing out of health concerns that they had. And I think occupational health and safety in terms of both mental health and physical health is actually another really relevant issue for a lot of young people. And it's not often talked about when we cover sort of traditional bread and butter labor issues like wages and benefits. But I think, along with job security, along with having more of a voice at work, and, for media workers, having things like just cause protections and just, a general, a more democratic, equitable workplace atmosphere. I think having a safe workplace and having a workplace that is is supportive of both mental and physical health is another issue that's particularly relevant to young people, and that's an issue that young people are willing to, during the pandemic, certainly have been willing to put themselves on the front line for. And I just wanted to note that I think, sort of in light of what others have said, is that, I think young people are also, that I speak to in the labor movement, when they are joining unions, many of them are forming rank and file caucuses in their unions. They're pressing union leadership to take bolder stances, and they're actually changing the way the mechanics of their unions work. And I think that's encouraging to see, and also pretty interesting. And I think that if these young people end up becoming, or they remain union members and they end up sort of becoming the next generation of union leadership, I think that would probably, that may fundamentally change the way unions operate in the US as well. Lastly, I think one of the issues that I was covering was the graduate workers at Columbia and their case before the NLRB, and how that ended up sort of, when the favorable ruling came down in 2016, sort of triggered a wave of organizing on private college campuses. But it was through that concerted effort that they actually got labor law essentially to change in the United States. And I think that one of the strengths that young workers have been seen to bring to the labor movement is doing things like bringing cases before the NLRB, changing the way labor law is applied, and also, in many ways, sort of changing the landscape of organizing, both inside and outside of formal unions, has been also pretty interesting to watch. I also think, I don't know if there are any other members of the media here, but in terms of how journalists cover the labor movement, I think that when we talk about young workers organizing, there's been a lot of focus in the media about like workers at Google, tech workers, and of course media workers as well. I think they tend to get a disproportionate share of media attention, in my view, because they are actually part of the media, but graduate workers as well. But I also think that there are actually young people working in a lot of different sectors. There are a lot of young people working on farms, for instance, and there are a lot of young workers working in the fast food industry. And we've seen, insurgent organizing movements come out of both of those sectors, but those workers aren't necessarily sort of coded as young in the media coverage. And I think that just as we should expand our view of what the labor movement can be for young workers, maybe we should also expand our view of what of who young people in the labor movement are.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thanks all our panelists. I'm going to spotlight all of the panel. So if anyone has questions for our panel, this goes until 4:15. But please put them in the chat right now, or use the raise hand feature if you would like to ask your question yourself. Oh, it looks like Lynn has a question. Actually, before we get to Lynn's question, I have one question that I'd like to ask about Alex's research. So you mentioned, Alex, that your slide showing that workers of color have kind of had a positive view of unions across generations, whereas white workers, it seems like a newer trend. Could you talk a little bit about that and maybe go into that a little bit more, and if anyone has a comment on why they think that is at this point? If the new organizing we're seeing is solely because young white workers are now realizing the precarity of the labor force, or what's happening there?
Sure, and I should be clear that while there are age gradients, for instance, to white workers, that these gradients have existed over time. So there's both we always have to keep in mind that there's both an age effect and a generation effect. So I think this is a case where there's an age effect, but perhaps not necessarily a generation effect, given that studies that were done 20 or so years ago identified a similar age gradient in the general public. But I think your other question is an especially important one, which is the racial and ethnic differences in support for unions and perception about unions. And I think there's a much broader and deeper support for the labor movement among workers of color. And if you sort of dig into the survey data, it's very clear that these workers tend to have stronger perceptions that unions would benefit, for instance, their ability to express voice, to secure stronger and safer working conditions and better benefits. And I think that comes from firsthand experience in many cases of seeing the role of the labor movement in boosting labor standards for workers of color in particular, and the longer political coalition of at least some components of the labor movement and the civil rights movement as well. I think there's a longer historical trajectory to be unpacked there.
Great, thank you. So Lynn asks, for Nastaran and I, we both mentioned that we bargain over some different issues when working with young workers. Would you like to go first on what some of those issues are?
No, you can go ahead, Kayla. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that really, some of the very standard contractual language that has actually very much resonated with young workers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll talk about the different stuff. You talk about the standard stuff. I think, young workers, they care about transparency and democracy and kind of the integrity of their organization. I think that I talked about having workers on the board of nonprofits. A ton of workers they care about the direction of their nonprofits. They feel like the board is disconnected and making decisions that aren't reflective of their actual work and how it affects the workers there. So that's been a great, kind of power sharing contract win. And then I think the other things about racial equity and inclusion are really important, and a lot of workers are pushing for those and getting like paid time or a paid, amount of budget set aside for trainings, for equity reviews, for things like that to eliminate some of this toxic culture that we're seeing at workplaces.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the same, media professionals. I would say across the board at most of our bargaining units where we're currently negotiating, we've been trying to push really robust diversity and inclusion language. In many of our contracts, we're pushing for the elimination of NDAs in the cases of, starting really in the cases of harassment and discrimination, but wanting to expand that even further. We know that NDAs have been expanded across so many industries and how crippling they are. But really, I think one of the more surprising things, I know at 39 years old, I think I'm at the point I can say the kids are all right. I think we've been really shocked to see that some of the really standard bread and butter issues are incredibly important to young workers. And there really isn't this distinction that has been made. And in the beginning, when media workers started organizing, a lot was said at the time in 2015, 2016, that media workers just wanted like quick, basic, bare bones contracts that increased their salaries, their wage floors, and that was it. And that they just wanted a contract fast. They wanted, some really, really basic provisions. And so at the NewsGuild, we have some pretty robust contracts, and we are adamant about preserving a lot of those hard-earned contractual standards. So a few years ago, when we started to see an attack on Just Cause, which started in a really sinister way. First, it was just a full-on, attack on Just Cause provisions within our contracts. And then council started to introduce language that had a carve out to Just Cause, which basically allowed employers to let an employee go for an editorial exception, which we know in an editorial profession is extremely important. So our entire union rallied, and we were told, and lawyers thought, that young workers didn't know enough about Just Cause and didn't care enough about Just Cause, that they would be able to ram this through. And our entire union rallied, and we were able to fight back the attack on Just Cause. The most public iteration of it was at the New Yorker. So it was a really heartening development to see just how much millennials care about Just Cause. They also care about no strike language. We're seeing a lot more questioning of no strike, no lockout language, which is, fostering some really amazing discussions. And then most recently, we have a lot of members who are, at our local, we're currently proposing a dues increase to fund several more years of this kind of record-breaking growth for us. And it's mostly the young members of our union who are absolutely okay with an increase in their dues and are excited about paying their dues. And it is largely the more senior members of our local who are a little bit more opposed to the proposal. So I think it really flips a lot of those notions that we had about young workers on their head, and is really, really exciting to see.
Great, thank you. Ken, do you want to add anything on that? Any interesting bargaining or
Sure. I'll be really quick. I mean, the equity inclusion stuff, and I would say non-economic justice issues in the workplace is probably at the center of driving a lot of the academic organizing these days. Not just the organizing, but representation post-contract. A lot of our new locals are very active and in using collective action in the process of enforcing people's rights around things like harassment and discrimination. It's been a huge feature of that organizing.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So M. Hillard asks about what would full unemployment or kind of low unemployment mean for organizing. Just quickly, based on my old EPI experience, basically that creates, more workers have more bargaining power when there's lower unemployment. And so they might be able to organize and get some actual wins and raise wages and tighten other working conditions. I don't know if Alex or anyone else wants to jump in on that question.
I hesitate to talk about the teacher strikes with Rebecca Given on the call as the guru on these, but I would say that I think those offer a great instructive example of how labor shortages can be important in some circumstances for creating the space for workers to organize and create disruption to demand exactly those changes that you're talking about, Kayla, as happened in several of those red states, particularly the initial states where there were early walkouts.
Great. So I would suggest that M. Hillard is writing additional comment. I would suggest you attend Elise Gould's panel, who is a labor economist, to talk about this if it didn't happen already. No worries. I'm just not an economist, and I don't think any of us on the panel are. So you should definitely, and EPI's new project on unequal bargaining power on their website is great and covers a lot of this. Rebecca, since you were mentioned and your hand has been up, go ahead. Hi.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. This was a great panel. I've really enjoyed hearing from all of you. I want to ask you, I don't know if it's not a hard question, but you can say whatever you want in this context, which is, how is this massive influx of young workers changing unions? And I think Nastaran mentioned it a bit, right? These horribly treated digital media workers have often much younger than the longer standing guild members. And then same with grad workers, which, by the way, Ken, kudos. I mean, bringing in, I think it's 20,000 new workers is really something, but that changes the composition of the unions themselves, right? They might push for different power structures, different priorities, different budgets, different dues. So I wonder, to the extent you're comfortable commenting here, if any of you, and I don't know, Kayla, the relationship between NPEU and IFPTE, and if that would also apply there. I think of IFPTE, I think Boeing, and not particularly young workers, although I'm sure there are some. So I'm curious about the internal changes to these unions as the share of younger workers in them grows.
Great. Ken, Nastaran, either of you want to comment?
Sure, I can go quickly. I mean, the transformation in our union has been incredible, and it's been a very short period of time when we're thinking about how long some of these changes take within union structures, just trying to address union democracy alone. So organizing brought in new workers. Those new workers then sat on our executive committee making decisions about our local. That in turn allowed us to affect the internal politics at the international, and we elected a reformer who came out of the Los Angeles Times, leading to some big changes on at the international. And then we, a year or two later, elected a reformer at our local. And so our union looks night and day different than it did in 2014, 2015. And so those executive committee members and the unit leadership of all of these new digital shops that we've organized, they're weighing in on dues structures, they're weighing in on union democracy, they're weighing in on getting police unions out of CWA, they're weighing in on so much. And the biggest, as Kayla said, it's really the union democracy piece that I think they want a union that they'll be proud of, really, at the end of the day. And they see their union as a vehicle for so many other things, not just helping their paycheck and their benefits at a digital media company.
Ken, you want to weigh in?
I think it is our, I guess, mostly young academic workers are heavily concentrated in a few geographic areas, but have definitely, created a new discussion around certain issues. I think have contributed to looking at things like discrimination and harassment more as a bargaining and contract enforcement issue than maybe had been for a long time. And in some ways that was reconnecting. For the UAW has a long history of bargaining over that topic, and in many ways led the way in getting sexual harassment into collective bargaining agreements. So I think it's been a very healthy thing overall for the union. I did want to say, Michelle mentioned the Columbia decision. I couldn't go without saying that the real story there was the fact that we managed to preserve that decision through 4 years of Donald Trump's NLRB, which was a major accomplishment.
Yeah, I remember reporting on the NLRB and noting that all of the graduate worker unions that had cases pending at the NLRB in a very organized manner all decided to withdraw their cases, and so that was a very good way of managing to stave that off. And thank God it only had to happen for 4 years.
All right, and with that, I think we actually have to end. Apparently they need this Zoom for the next panel, but I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today, and thank you everyone who participated. And if our panelists want to quickly share their emails or their social media, if anyone wants to follow up with them in the chat, go ahead.
And thank you, Lynn Reinhardt, for putting us together.
Yes, thank you so much, Lynn.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn.
Okay, great. I'm going to end this. Thanks so much.
Have a good day.